What happens when a legend's legacy is dragged through the mud on live television? Clint Eastwood, the man whose steely gaze and gravelly voice defined decades of cinema, sat across from Jimmy Kimmel, his jaw tight, eyes burning with a fire that could melt steel. The studio audience buzzed with anticipation, sensing the tension before a single word was spoken. Kimmel, with his sly grin and sharp tongue, had built a career on poking fun, but tonight he'd crossed a line. Eastwood wasn't here to promote a new film or trade pleasantries. He was here to settle a score. For weeks, Kimmel had been taking cheap shots at Eastwood's age, his politics, and his latest directorial project, a gritty war film that honored veterans. On his late-night show, Kimmel had mocked the movie as a tired old man's fantasy, dismissing the sacrifices it portrayed as outdated. The audience had laughed then, but now, with Eastwood in the chair, the air crackled with unease. Kimmel leaned back, his smirk barely hiding his nerves, and opened with a jab. "So, Clint, you're what, 100 now? Still think you can keep up with the young directors?" The crowd tittered, but Eastwood didn't flinch. His voice, low and deliberate, cut through the noise. "You talk a big game, Jimmy, but you wouldn't last a day in the world I've lived through." The audience gasped, some cheering, others frozen. Kimmel's smile faltered, but he doubled down, his tone biting. "Oh, come on, Clint, your films are ancient history. Nobody cares about your cowboy shtick anymore." Eastwood's fingers curled into fists, his knuckles whitening. He'd come prepared for a fight, but not for Kimmel's relentless disrespect. The host, sensing blood, pressed harder. "Your new movie's just pandering to the old folks, right? All this hero nonsense. People want fresh stories, not your dusty reruns." Eastwood leaned forward, his voice a growl. "You think you know heroes, Jimmy? You sit behind a desk, cracking jokes, while men and women bleed for this country. You wouldn't know courage if it slapped you." The crowd erupted, some shouting support for Eastwood, others egging Kimmel on. The host's eyes narrowed, his ego bruised. He wasn't about to let a man twice his age humiliate him on his own show. "You're out of touch, Clint," Kimmel snapped, his voice dripping with venom. "Your whole tough guy act is a relic. Nobody buys it anymore." Eastwood stood, towering over the desk, his presence commanding silence. "You want to talk relics? Look in the mirror, Jimmy. You're a clown who's forgotten how to respect what matters." The audience roared, the tension boiling over. Producers scrambled backstage, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the chaos unfold. Kimmel, red-faced, shot back, "You're just mad because the world moved on without you." Eastwood's eyes locked onto Kimmel's, unyielding. "The world moves on, sure, but it don't forget the truth. You're gonna learn that tonight." The crowd was on its feet, the studio electric with raw energy. This wasn't just a talk show anymore. It was a battlefield, and Eastwood was ready to draw blood. The studio vibrated with the crowd's roars, a mix of cheers and jeers that fueled the fire between Clint Eastwood and Jimmy Kimmel. Eastwood stood tall, his shadow looming over the desk, his words still hanging in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Kimmel, his face flushed with anger, gripped the edges of his desk, desperate to regain control of his show. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not by someone who could command a room with a single glance. The audience sensed blood, their shouts growing louder, some chanting Eastwood's name, others egging Kimmel to hit back. The host forced a laugh, sharp and hollow, trying to mask his unease. "You think you're some kind of hero, Clint? Sitting there, preaching about truth? You're just a washed-up actor playing dress-up." The words were venomous, meant to cut deep, and they did. Eastwood's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want to talk about playing, Jimmy? You play at being a man every night, hiding behind your jokes. I've faced real fights, real loss. What have you faced? A bad rating?" The crowd erupted again, the noise deafening. Kimmel's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. He leaned forward, pointing a finger at Eastwood. "Don't lecture me, old man. You're here because you need my show to stay relevant. Your movie's a flop, and you know it." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it was a lie meant to wound. Eastwood's film had struck a chord with veterans and their families, earning praise for its raw honesty. But Kimmel didn't care about that. He cared about winning, about making Eastwood look small. The legend stepped closer, his boots heavy on the stage floor, his voice steady but laced with fury. "You don't get to rewrite my life to fit your narrative, Jimmy. You mock what you can't understand. Sacrifice, honor, the cost of war. You think that's a game?" Kimmel scoffed, rolling his eyes, but the gesture felt forced, his confidence cracking. "Sacrifice? Give me a break. You're just mad because I called your movie what it is. Boring." The audience gasped, some booing, others laughing nervously. Eastwood's jaw clenched, but he didn't shout. Instead, he spoke with a calm that was more terrifying than rage. "You call it boring because you've never had to live it. I made that film for people who've seen hell, not for cowards who mock them from a cushy chair." The crowd roared, the energy tilting in Eastwood's favor. Kimmel, sensing the shift, tried to pivot, his voice rising. "You're so full of yourself, Clint. You think you're untouchable because you're a legend? Legends fade, pal." Eastwood didn't budge, his stare cutting through Kimmel like a blade. "Legends don't fade when they stand for something. You're just noise." The audience was on its feet, the studio shaking with their cheers. Backstage, producers whispered frantically, torn between letting the clash continue and pulling the plug. Kimmel's eyes darted to the crowd, then back to Eastwood, his composure unraveling. He'd underestimated the man, thinking he could bully him into submission. Now, with the room against him, he needed a new move, something to flip the script. He leaned back, crossing his arms, and sneered. "You want to talk truth, Clint? Let's talk about your politics, your controversies. You're not as clean as you think." The accusation hung heavy, a cheap shot meant to derail Eastwood and shock the audience. The crowd hushed, waiting for the legend's response, the tension thick enough to choke on. Kimmel's words landed like a sucker punch, his sneer daring Eastwood to take the bait. The audience held its breath, the silence heavy, every eye locked on the man who'd built a career on standing tall. Eastwood didn't flinch, but his face hardened, the lines etched deeper by years of battles both on screen and off. He stepped closer to the desk, his voice low, each word deliberate. "You want to dig into my past, Jimmy? Go ahead. I've made mistakes, owned them. Can you say the same? Or are you too busy throwing stones from your glass house?" The crowd erupted, cheers drowning out Kimmel's attempt to interrupt. The host's eyes flashed with panic, his plan backfiring. He'd hoped to rattle Eastwood, to paint him as a flawed relic, but the legend turned the tables with ease. Kimmel scrambled, his voice sharp and unsteady. "Don't act all high and mighty, Clint. You've said plenty of things that'd get you canceled today. You're no saint." Eastwood's lips twitched, not a smile but a grim acknowledgement. "I never claimed to be, but I don't hide behind a fake laugh tearing down folks who've earned their scars. You want to talk controversies? How about you mocking veterans on your show, calling their stories old news?" The audience gasped, a wave of boos aimed at Kimmel. The host's face burned red, his hands slamming the desk. "That's not what I said, and you know it. You're twisting my words to play the victim." Eastwood shook his head, his voice cutting like a knife. "Twisting? I heard you, Jimmy. I heard you laugh at men and women who fought for your right to sit there and run your mouth. You think that's funny?" The crowd's roar was deafening, a tidal wave of support for Eastwood. Kimmel's confidence crumbled, his eyes darting to the producers, who stood frozen backstage. He tried to pivot, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, please, Clint. You're turning this into a soap opera. Nobody's buying your hero of the people act." But the audience was buying it, their cheers shaking the studio. Eastwood leaned in, his voice a growl. "You don't get it, do you? I don't care what you think of me. I care about the people you've disrespected, the ones who don't get a stage to fight back." A woman in the audience stood, shouting, "Tell him, Clint!" Others joined, their voices a chorus of defiance. Kimmel, cornered, lashed out. "You're just a bully with a badge, Clint. You come here, acting like you own the place, but you're nothing without your old movies." The insult was desperate, and Eastwood's response was ice-cold. "And you're nothing without an audience to clap like trained seals. Difference is, I earned my place. You're just riding mine." The crowd exploded, some standing, others chanting Eastwood's name. Kimmel's hands shook, his ego battered. He'd tried to humiliate a legend, but Eastwood's resolve was unbreakable. The host glanced at the clock, hoping to cut to commercial, but the producers signaled to keep going. The ratings were soaring. Kimmel, desperate to save face, leaned forward, his voice venomous. "You think you've won, Clint? This is my show, and I'll bury you before we're done." Eastwood's eyes glinted, unflinching. "Try it, Jimmy. Let's see who's standing when the dust settles." The tension was unbearable, the audience hanging on every word, waiting for the next blow. Kimmel's threat hung in the air, a desperate gamble to claw back control, but Eastwood stood unmoved, his presence a wall of unyielding strength. The audience was electric, their cheers and shouts a roaring tide that seemed to lift the legend higher, while Kimmel sank lower. The host's eyes darted, searching for an escape, but the crowd's energy pinned him to his chair. He forced a grin, his voice sharp with malice. "You're all talk, Clint. You come here, throwing your weight around, but you're just an old man with a grudge. Nobody cares about your war stories." The words were meant to sting, to reduce Eastwood to a caricature, but they only fueled the fire. Eastwood took a slow step forward, his boots echoing on the stage, his voice steady as granite. "You keep talking about age, Jimmy, like it's a weakness. Takes years to learn what matters, to know what's worth fighting for. You wouldn't understand. You're too busy chasing laughs." The crowd roared, a wave of support that shook Kimmel's fragile bravado. He slammed his fist on the desk, his voice rising to a near shout. "You don't scare me, Clint. You think you can walk in here and lecture me? This is my turf, and I'll say what I want." Eastwood's eyes locked onto Kimmel's, unblinking, his words cutting deeper than any yell. "Your turf? You're a guest in this world, Jimmy. Same as me. Difference is, I respect the ground I stand on. You just spit on it." The audience erupted, some standing, others clapping wildly, their voices a chorus of defiance. Kimmel's face twisted, his anger boiling over. "Respect? You're a hypocrite. You act like some noble cowboy, but you're just selling a fantasy to people too dumb to see through it." The insult was a low blow, aimed at Eastwood's fans as much as the man himself. A man in the crowd shouted, "Shut up, Kimmel!" and others joined, their boos drowning out the host's next words. Eastwood raised a hand, silencing the audience with a single gesture. "You want to call my work a fantasy? Fine. But those people you're insulting? They're the ones who keep this country standing. They're not dumb. They're stronger than you'll ever be." The crowd's cheers were deafening, a tidal wave of loyalty. Kimmel, cornered, tried one last jab, his voice trembling with rage. "You're delusional, Clint. You think you're some kind of savior? You're just a has-been who can't let go." Eastwood's response was calm, almost quiet, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "I don't need to be a savior, Jimmy. I just need to tell the truth. You're running from it." The studio shook with applause, the audience on its feet, their voices a wall of sound. Backstage, producers exchanged frantic glances, knowing the show was spiraling beyond their control. Kimmel's hands clenched, his eyes wild with frustration. He'd tried to break Eastwood, to make him flinch, but the legend was untouchable. The host leaned forward, his voice a hiss. This isn't over, Clint. I'll make sure everyone sees you for what you are. A stubborn old fool. Eastwood's gaze didn't waver, his voice low and final. Go ahead, Jimmy. Show the world who you are. They're watching. The crowd's roar reached a fever pitch, the tension so thick it felt like the room might burst. The studio was a powder keg, the audience's cheers a spark ready to ignite the final clash. Clint Eastwood stood like a monument, his eyes fixed on Jimmy Kimmel, who squirmed under the weight of his own failed attacks. The host's last threat lingered, a weak attempt to salvage his pride, but the crowd's loyalty had shifted. They were with Eastwood, their voices a thunderous wave of support, chanting his name as Kimmel's face twisted with desperation. He rose from his chair, pointing at Eastwood, his voice shrill. You think you've got everyone fooled, Clint? You're not some hero. You're just a guy who got lucky with a few movies. The words were a final stab, but they fell flat, swallowed by the audience's boos. Eastwood didn't move, his voice steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. Lucky? I worked for every inch, Jimmy. Built something real, something that lasts. You? You're just a voice that fades when the show ends. The crowd exploded, their applause shaking the floor. Kimmel's eyes widened, his hands trembling as he realized he'd lost the room. He tried to shout over the noise, his voice cracking. You're nothing without your fans, Clint. You're just riding their cheers. Eastwood stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his words slow and deliberate. My fans? They're people who know what it means to stand for something. You've spent your life tearing that down. That's why you're alone up here. The audience roared, some standing, others shouting encouragement, their voices a wall of defiance. Kimmel's face crumpled, his bravado gone. He sank back into his chair, his hands gripping the armrests, searching for a comeback Dan Shizhao Budao. Eastwood turned to the crowd, his voice rising for the first time, not in anger, but in conviction. This ain't about me. It's about the people you've mocked, Jimmy. The ones who fight, who sacrifice, who keep this world turning. You don't get to spit on their stories and call it a joke. The crowd was on its feet, their cheers deafening, a tidal wave of emotion. A veteran in the audience, his eyes wet, stood and saluted Eastwood, a gesture that rippled through the room as others joined. Kimmel, defeated, stared at the desk, his voice barely a whisper. You win, Clint. Happy now? Eastwood shook his head, his tone firm but not cruel. It ain't about winning, Jimmy. It's about doing right. Maybe one day you'll figure that out. The audience's applause reached a crescendo, a triumphant roar that filled every corner of the studio. Backstage, producers threw up their hands knowing the show had become something bigger than ratings. Eastwood turned, not to leave, but to face the crowd, raising a hand in quiet acknowledgement. The gesture wasn't grand, but it was enough. A symbol of a man who'd stood his ground, not for himself, but for those he'd sworn to honor. Kimmel sat silent, his head bowed, the fight drained out of him. The audience kept cheering, not just for Eastwood, but for the truth he'd defended, a truth that resonated deep in their hearts. As the show's theme music played, signaling the end, the crowd's energy didn't fade. They'd witnessed a legend take down a bully, not with fists, but with words that carried the weight of a lifetime. Eastwood walked off the stage, his head high, leaving Kimmel to face the silence of his own making.